Understanding Data Flow in Dynamics GP. My name is Dave Caldwell. I've been with Costerisan since 2001. I'm a partner here in the firm and been specializing in primarily support with Great Plains, implementation, as well as project management. So let's get started. I think you'll be a bit surprised how much you do understand a lot about data flow in GP, particularly if you've had some knowledge or experience with Great Plains. But the issue at hand is that many of you are presumably coming here to try to understand data flow so that you can get better at reporting, possibly inquiry, and then trying to understand how did things get placed the way they did and in terms of the timing. So I want to try to answer a lot of that, and I want to make sure that at least as an overview that you have at least somewhat of a good entry into understanding data flows. And I want to start out by saying, well, why do we ask how things work? And we do that because we want to understand a cause and effect. That's our world, and we oftentimes want to understand what brought about a certain change, particularly if we're talking about our system, what was the thing that caused it, and trying to understand the effect or the outcome of system data is oftentimes asking what caused it, and along with that is trying to understand the trail between the cause and effect. We also ask how things work because we want to understand how we can influence the outcome. So if there's a certain outcome, certain way in which we want the data to appear, something that we want to change in the system, could be an update as far as a journal entry is concerned, could be something that we're trying to report, something that we're trying to inquiry, and we want to try to influence that. We oftentimes have to understand how things work within that system in order to influence that outcome. We also ask and try to understand how a change in effect can explain the cause. So we know the effect, so we come back and try to understand what could possibly be the thing that we might influence as far as the cause in order to get the outcome that we're looking for. We also try to understand how things work in order to master the use. So as time goes on, I think you all would admit is that your first blush at Great Plains is it seemed to be a little bit overwhelming. There was a lot to it. There was a lot to understand. There was a lot to consider. And as time went on, you, of course, began to master parts, if not all of the system, as you become more and more acquainted and you use the system more and more. And you got to know how things work within that system. We also ask how things work to understand who, what, when, and where. Particularly if we have numbers that we're trying to reconcile and we're not quite certain as to how the number had got to the place that it's gotten to. How did that value get there? Why is the value at the number that it's at? Or perhaps maybe there are some changes in some of the master record data. That would be maybe there was a change of an address. Maybe there was a change in an employee's W-2 information. So understanding who, what, when, and where, it goes along the same lines of asking how things work. And then particularly, I think most of you are here, is to understand where we need to look in order to find what we're looking for. Sounds a bit circular, but in order to present, which is ultimately our responsibility with the use of the system, is to presenting what we've accumulated, presenting to other people who are interested in the finances of our organization, to decision makers in order for them to make informed decisions, and to present a way of giving that information in an understandable format so that we can plot our course for the future. So the old adage of looking underneath the hood of the car is like looking for something underneath a rock. You never know what you're going to find until you upset the rock and you find what either you were looking for or something you weren't looking for. But oftentimes that looking underneath that rock, or particularly if we analogize a hood of the car, we don't know what we're looking at. And if we use the car analogy, we know that we can put the key in the ignition, and we know that we supply enough fuel, we do enough maintenance on the vehicle, that vehicle is going to get us to where we need to be and at least satisfy the goal of why we're using the vehicle. But at some point in time during your use of that vehicle, you have to begin to understand pieces and parts of that vehicle and why certain things are influenced in terms of the performance of that vehicle. So we do have to look underneath the hood to one extent or another. But oftentimes it turns out to be really confusing. Oftentimes it doesn't necessarily mean we'll find what we're looking for. So oftentimes we think about it like looking underneath a rock. So why does it feel like when we look for something in our accounting system, it feels like we are looking underneath a rock? Well, one, we're not looking in the right place. We don't know how or where to look. We don't know what we are looking at. We don't understand what we need to do with what we found. And that last point there is probably more implicative of what you are faced with, particularly when it comes down to when you are looking for something in the accounting system and trying to understand what it is you found and what was its origin and how did we get to where we are with what we have. So I want to try to dig into that a little bit and give you a little bit of insight and perhaps give you at least a starting understanding of how we go about where to look, what's the right place. And then, just as importantly, what are we looking at when we do find it? All right, so what is the significance of understanding data flows in an ERP system? So an ERP being your enterprise resource planning software. That is your accounting system. That is the Great Plains system, of which we have as a point of investigation here today. So what's the significance of understanding data flow? Well, you can find things a lot easier. Things begin to make sense. You understand how A produced B. You understand why your numbers change the way they do. You begin to understand that when we look for perhaps an accounts payable paid invoice, it's no longer in open, it's in historical. And perhaps if we're trying to eliminate or void a check, if we're dealing with accounts payable as an example, we have to look for the check in history as opposed to open. And why does it, when we do void the check, that the invoice moves from history to open? All of these kind of things are plotting the course for a data flow in the system. And if we understand the data flow, and that is movement of data through the system, we at least begin to understand where we can find things in the system when it comes time for us to report an inquiry. Another significant factor is the use of the system becomes more, your use of the system becomes much more sophisticated. You are in better management and control of understanding data going into the system, being able to do a little better problem solving, being able to make those reversing entries and understanding what kind of impact that it might have on the system. You have better control over the system, as I mentioned earlier, and yours and others' decision making is more informed. And I think ultimately that's what we're after, is at least we want to be able to produce things that we can explain, reports and inquiries that give us better insight and understanding. And to understand how and where things flowed and where they flowed from, give us that kind of information in a much more enriched way. So understanding the data flows, way to understand data flows. In other words, here's the approach that I want for you to consider. And this is probably one of the most important aspects that I can at least impress on all of you, is knowing your system from an operational aspect. It's very difficult to understand how data flows from the accounts payable system into the bank reconciliation module, into the cash management module, into the general ledger system, unless you understand the system that you're working with. And knowing the operational aspects is an extremely good foundation to begin to understand data flows in the system. So I can't really say enough about that. Defining understanding between master record data storage versus transactional record data storage. So the thing that I really want for you to begin thinking about here as we begin our investigation and go through this investigation is understanding the difference between how master record data and transactional record data flows through the system, where it's found, how do you go about looking for it, what is impacted during the posting process. Master record data is defined as that card record data, so that would be your general ledger chart of accounts. That would be your vendors, that would be your customers, your payroll employees, the inventory master records. Those are all master records in the system that primarily stay pretty much the same and don't change too much over time, but part of the master record data that we consider is also summary information that we consider. So you'll know that when you go in and you look at an accounts payable vendor, you have the opportunity of looking at some of the summary information. Summary information being total invoice year-to-date dollar amount, number of invoices year-to-date, life-to-date information, cash payments. All of that is summarized information that really sets itself apart as being part of the master record data. Transactional record data is probably a little more complicated in terms of how it moves throughout the system. The transactional data is that type of data that would be considered as an example of general ledger transactions. These are the invoices that you put into accounts payable. These are the checks that you run through the accounts payable system, the debit and the credit memos. As far as accounts receivable is concerned, this would be your invoices, debit memos, cash receipts that you receive from customers. If we're talking about the inventory system, if you're using in our inventory system, it would be records that would increase and decrease inventory and many, many aspects as to what affects those parts of the system in terms of transactional record data storage. So they are the most complicated, but they are the ones that are type of data that we normally are going to look toward in order to help us out with much of the reporting that we're looking for. Understanding programming procedures. Now, I'm not suggesting that you all turn into programmers by any stretch of the imagination. What I am suggesting is to understand programmatically how things work in the system. So this is going beyond the 3x5 index card. In other words, there are folks who really find it more comfortable to operate systems if they have a step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, without necessarily clearly understanding all of the other parts of the system that might be impacted by their choices in terms of the steps that they walk through. So this is going beyond that. It is understanding conceptually how that program works and understanding its handling of the data. Understanding data storage methods. So when I'm talking about data storage methods, I'm talking about the understanding that many people have when they start to consider an accounting system, unlike a word processing system or a spreadsheet system, is that data is stored in many different locations. And what one would expect, especially when it comes to trying to understand where to find data and how data is stored and how data is moved from one location to another, we don't necessarily think of data inside of an accounting system as being stored in a file per se, but rather in tables. So tables make up the overall data that is summarized and accumulated all together that represents the company data that you have been inputting and reporting from. I mentioned understanding tables. Tables is very important in terms of understanding data flows, and especially when it comes for you to trying to find the data that you're looking for. And then, of course, the relationships between tables and the data paths that are taken from one module to another, as an example, or from one table to another. Payroll, for example, if many of you may be using payroll. So we know that when we put in payroll time transactions, nothing is financially happening in the system. But we do go through a series of procedures where we build, we produce the calculation on the checks to finally where we actually produce the checks and then post the checks in the system. So when we begin to look at how that data is stored in those tables and the data path that it took for all the data that seemingly you entered in one screen, is that it's scattered across multiple tables, and how that data streams and is connected to one another from the table aspect and the paths that it took in terms of when that posting process took place. All right, so general overview of GP master record storage. Okay, and I just want to kind of take just a basic approach to this as we go through this, is that if we look at setting up a vendor, we know that we are going to go to a vendor maintenance screen as we enter in a vendor. But then as we go through and we fill out beyond the vendor ID and the vendor name and the addresses, we also get into other ancillary type of information about that vendor. So as an example is that we may be setting up a vendor and we have additional data. So for example, that additional data could very well be the posting accounts that we would normally want a vendor's invoice to post to. We may have additional addresses that we are inputting for this vendor that we need to keep track of. Each piece of that data can be stored in different tables, and the way in which when we enter in that vendor or change the vendor data is flowed to different tables within the system. So the challenge becomes is that if I'm going to produce a simple list of vendors and their addresses, I'm not going to find the vendor addresses and all the vendors simply in one spot. I may find them in multiple tables. And so this is all happening behind the scenes when you set up the vendor and you press the save button, is that the system is picking that data up and spreading it across multiple tables so that when you are ready to retrieve it, it is important for you to understand how and where the data flowed to when that storage took place. The other thing which is very interesting is the vendor summary. The vendor summary says is what we've accumulated over time, and that would be my month to date, year to date, life to date in terms of the number of invoices, year to date payments that have been made, stored in a completely separate table but updated, interestingly enough, during a posting routine when we post our invoices or post our checks. So there's an awful lot of connection here that's going on in terms of how tables are updated, but the data flow is something that we don't see happening on the screen but is happening behind the scenes, and then leaves us in a big question is where are we going to find it once we have posted or either stored. So let's talk about transactional records somewhat in contrast here. And for many of you who are in the day-to-day and posting throughout the system, what you're going to find throughout Great Plains in most, if not all, of the modules is that there are three major types of transactional records that you are affecting, but dependent upon where and what you are doing in terms of storage within the system. So let's look at these three basic components, and this is going to be extremely important that you keep this in mind in terms of data flow, particularly when you are trying to understand how data is flowing within a module as well as from one module to the next. So let's look at work tables, or what is referred to work. Now, for example, if you're inside of GP and you're doing an inquiry, oftentimes on a transactional inquiry, you're going to be asked whether or not are you looking for transactional records belonging to work, open, or history. You have that option of displaying either all three or two or either one or the other. Now, the importance of this is to understand basically this, is that when we are placing transactional records in a batch, and we know that Great Plains is a batch-orientated system, is that entries that we place in a batch are going into what are called the work tables, or what Great Plains refers to, particularly when you're doing an inquiry from the menuing, is that these are work entries. Seems like an odd term, but this is what Great Plains refers to it as. Now, we understand work entries or transactional entries as being unposted entries. That is, these entries are not creating any type of financial transaction or any type of financial change within the system. They're being placed in a location to where we can later examine them and then finally make the decision to post these entries as permanent entries into the system. So work entries are those that we can edit, we can change, we can remove, but they're going into a special place, being held in a special place until we create an action on these called posting. So work as its destination in terms of workflow. Once we post work or unposted batch entries, we post them, they go into what's called the open transaction tables. This is the natural data flow that we find when we post journal entries, the natural data flow when we post accounts payable invoices, the natural entries when we're in payroll and producing payroll. We have put in time ticket entries, and we're now walking through the process of building, calculating, and then producing checks, and then finally posting those checks. So up until that point in time, they go into open, and posting the balances, posting the remaining entries, go into an open transaction table. And we find open transactions to be very prevalent, and seeing these type of entries in the accounts payable system, the accounts receivable system, the general ledger system. And each one of these open type of transaction entries have a different meaning on a per entry basis, per module basis. Then finally, open entries eventually evolve or grow up to be, as I like to refer to them as going into history. This is the next data flow step inside of the Great Plains system having to do with transactional records. Historical records are those entries that are generally understood as being paid records, records that have reached their final destination and have accumulated as being part of a prior year, part of an entry that was paid, part of an entry that might have been credited. Typically, when we're looking at the accounts payable system and in the accounts receivable system, historical records generally have no balance remaining. Open transactions generally have a balance remaining, and that's how the system generally is able to judge when and how it's going to move open transactions to history. So as an example, when you were going through and doing a check posting inside of accounts payable, those open invoices that you selected that are now being paid, and upon which when you post the checks that you just now printed, what is happening during that posting routine is both the checks and the invoices that the checks paid are being taken out of the open transactional tables and moved to history. So the implication here is that when you begin to look for data, you have to understand whether or not the data is in history, open, or work, because it will influence you in terms of how you inquiry and how you report. So the common action here, as it typically is across most, if not all the modules in the system, is the common action is the posting action that generally moves things to history. One thing in contrast for those of you who might be using purchase order. Purchase order is a little bit different. When we start to look at purchase orders themselves, we place purchase orders into the purchase order system, and they are held into what's called the open purchase order table. A purchase order normally is not thought of as having any kind of financial impact on the system, but eventually becomes closed. And closing a PO, as an example, means to having an invoice placed against the PO, and whatever goods and services that was ordered on the PO have been received. We have as an election to take those closed POs and move them to history. So one of the things that we do need to keep in mind is that some modules do not automatically, in terms of their data flow, move things from open to history. Sometimes it is an election by you as a user or as a manager or an administrator of the system to move open data to history. Now, I'm going to get into a little bit of this, but I do want to kind of tell you is that particularly for those of you who are destined to not only understanding the data flow and what drove you to trying to understand data flows in the system, is also working with some of the data tables to being able to pull data out of the system. So if you're relegated to using the reports inside of Great Plains that have already been predefined, if you're relegated to using the inquiries within Great Plains, some of what you see here is not going to be important. But if you are that type who is using Excel, using another type of reporting tool that might be setting outside of your Great Plains system to getting at the data outside of Great Plains directly to the data tables, this is very, very important for you to know how to identify one table from another, and in terms of where the table's data's origins from. So as you can see, is that when we start to look at tables, and tables have names and they have numbers attached to them, and I'll show you that in just a few minutes, is that generally they have a prefix in front of the number that's been assigned to the table, and that prefix defines or helps you understand the type of data or its an origin of the data within the system. Okay, and you can see those acronyms that are there and available. The other thing is, and this is something really important to understand, and I'm talking to those people particularly who are those who are going to be using tools outside of Great Plains, who are wanting to have direct access to the tables and to understand what are those numbers what do they mean in terms of their significance. So we know that the characters that have been assigned to the tables that tell us the origin of the data, but these numbers that have been assigned also tell us the type of tables that they are. So if you look at here, master tables are generally preceded with 00. Those last 3 digits are used to number the tables incrementally as the number of tables increase. So for example, I can tell you that the vendor master table is preceded with the word PM, that is payables management, and then 00200, which refers to the vendor master. You can see that work tables are generally preceded with the 10,000 number. Open tables are preceded with 20,000, 30,000 for tables. And some of the others type of tables, which I'm not going to place as much emphasis on today, are setup tables. So you can think of setup tables as being those setup options that we visited a long time ago when we did the implementation, and that is going in and setting up the parameters for which the module is going to work. So for example, what was our starting journal entry number in General Ledger? As far as accounts receivable is concerned, what was our starting invoice number that we were going to use? So some of that kind of things that the setup tables contain. Temp tables are used in the system and are clearly unaccessible. They only hold data for as long as they are required. Temp tables are used during a posting process to assist the data flow within the system as it moves data from one part of the system to another. Temp tables are used to summarize data, to hold data during the posting process, but at the end of that procedure and posting process is those tables are generally wiped clean so that they have a clean opening when they are reused at a later time. Relational tables, this gets into a little more relational database management within the system, probably something that is a little bit beyond our scope for today. Reporting options tables, I'm sure many of you know about reporting options. So when you go in and you set up a report within Great Plains and you store that option, the option being, you know, the date range that you may be using. Maybe it's perhaps the range of the master record that you want to use in order to pull specific information out. Perhaps maybe you're wanting to pull from the open or historical tables. Those are the types of questions that are being asked prior to producing the report, and when you save that information, it's going into the option table. The option tables are identified as 7,000 or 70,000 type tables. And then those reprint table posting reports. So we know this about Great Plains as part of the data flow, especially during the posting process, is that many areas within the system allow us to reprint journals. So as an example of something perhaps might have gone wrong during the posting process, or probably more importantly, or something that would be more likely to happen, is that the posting journal that you printed out after posting those cash receipts that were entered into the system and posted inside of accounts receivable, perhaps maybe the printer didn't print that journal out, or perhaps maybe you lost it and you need to get it reproduced. So all of that type of data is flowed during the posting process into the 80,000 tables. So these are the kind of things that are backdrops, particularly for those people who are using tools outside of Great Plains to have access to those to that data. Now, one of the things here that is available to you are a couple of URLs that will take you to different blogs that will also give you a little more information to today's business and presentation. Part of my presentation today, and I have to give credit where credit is due, is from these blogsters that address data flows within Great Plains. So real important to have nice notes, and also goes into some deeper explanation as to what our time will be allowed for today. Without further ado, what I want to do is I want to set aside here the PowerPoint presentation, and what I want to do next is I want to begin to do a little bit of investigation. And I want to go into Great Plains, and I want to use a couple of systems in terms of trying to draw some familiarity with you. And I want to go back in and kind of review a couple of things that we were talking about a little earlier in terms of transactions. And I'm going to use accounts payable as an example here. And actually, I think I'm going to do it a little bit different point here, transactions by vendor. Now this is really what I was looking at. So as you recall, when we were talking about transactional type of data within the system, and we can categorize them as being either work, open, or history, is that I want to choose a vendor out here and kind of prove a point. Let's go into the Ace Travel Company, and one of the things that I want you to look at with me is over here under Origin. What we're getting here is a list of documents that are either in open or either history. I don't know that I have any, well I do. I do have one document here that is unposted. But you can see by virtue of me coming in and calling up Ace Travel, what I'm looking at here is work or open or historical records. So right away, by definition, I can tell you this record is in batch. This is an unposted document. Okay? And we know this is that when we post documents, is that I said earlier that the next step in the data flow within the system is going to open. So what we're seeing here is a representation of open invoices. These would be invoices that still have a balance remaining on them. Because the next step in the line of data flow for open invoices is once we pay them, or in other words, we bring the balances of the invoices to zero, they automatically move from open to history. So a payment that is in history is a payment that has been fully applied. A payment that might be in open is a payment that is not completely and fully applied, as would be a credit memo. So when you think about this, and the importance of this is that posting is really what moved the data from work to open to history. And there are certain activities that occurred. And Great Plains, in terms of the mines in Fargo, when they first designed Great Plains, is that they needed to show separation between this data. Our challenge is that when we're looking for something, we might have an invoice number, and the Great Plains challenges us to asking the question, is it an open, is it in history, is it an unposted data? So when I'm in here doing an inquiry, I can of course narrow my scope and only display those records that are open. And the same thing is true with work if all I wanted to see is seeing work records, okay, and as well as history, okay. So when we start to look at the place where these these pieces of data are stored, they are stored in different tables. So I want to take you to a tool here called Management Studio. This is something that your IT folks would most likely have access to. Some of you may have access to it, but we use this as a tool in order to get directly to the tables. All right? So when I call up Management Studio, this gives me the ability to get into the tables directly and to be able to expose the raw data. Now, here's what I was telling you a little bit earlier. Here are all the tables that belong to this particular company called the Fabricam company. And as you can see, as I just scroll down, we have a number of tables out here. And of course, this is where some of the confusion begins with many people who are wanting to attach a report writer and to figuring out what type of and which table do I need to get to in order to produce the data that I'm looking for. So if I go down here far enough, I'm going to get into the PM tables. And I just want to show you a little bit here of what I was talking about. And let me go back up here a little bit, is that here's the 2000 table. The PM 2000 table, and I just know this by experience, is that it shows me all of the open transactions within the system. And here they are. Here's the voucher number, here is the document number, here is the vendor record, and here's the current transaction amount. And these are where these records live before they actually are posted. Now some of this, and perhaps much of this, does look a little esoteric, but this is important to know in terms of where its life cycle is in terms of each one of the records. So here it happens to be one of the records that I think that we were looking at a little earlier here, the 100.3, maybe I'm not right on that one, but this is a document. There's some of these documents out here that we should see through open that, well, there we go right there. There is that record right here that we're exposing that record directly through the Management Studio, and here it lies right here. Now, in contrast to that is the 30,000 table. The 30,200 table is actually where all of the historical records are stored. Okay? So the movement of these is that During the posting process, the data is flowed from the 20,000 table into the 30,200 table. There are other ancillary tables that are attached here. So right here this happens to be a table that displays or stores all the distribution records to general ledger from all these posted historical transactions. So especially when we're using a reporting tool, it's important to know that how data flowed from one to the other. It's important to know whether or not it's open or historical. So this is a very nice tool in order to help us understanding and being able to expose the data in the raw. Okay. Now, one of the impacts that you have in understanding this, particularly from a payables point of view, is when you void transactions. There's been an awful lot of confusion here when it comes to thinking about voiding open transactions versus historical transactions. Why aren't these all just combined under one, as an example? Well, part of the reason is because when we're voiding open transactions, we're voiding only open invoices, and that would be unpaid invoices as it is in regard to the purchasing module. However, if we're going to avoid historical transactions, the only type of historical transactions that we can remove in this system are the payments. Payments are what brought these invoices, paid documents, to the historical. So once we remove the payment or void the payment, part of this process of voiding historical transactions, and in the background, when we close this screen after we identify which payments that we're going to void, is that it moves invoices, those invoices that were once in history, back to open because now they're showing as unpaid. That's a data flow within the system, and it's particularly important to understand that if we are wanting to take an invoice that was once paid, that was once entered incorrectly, and we need to get rid of both payment as well as the invoice, there are steps to follow, and part of that step is understanding the data flow within Great Plains. Understanding that we've got to void the check before we can void the invoice. The invoice moves from historical to open, and then thereby gives us the ability to void the invoice if that's our mission. Now, one thing to understand in terms of a data flow between accounts receivable and accounts payable. We know that when we go through and we print checks inside of accounts payable, is that open invoices are moved from open to history. That's part of the posting process. That happens automatically. In contrast to that, is accounts receivable. When we are entering in transactions inside of the receivable transaction entry screen, they first go into batch. When we post the batch of invoices, they go into open. When we pay invoices through cash receipt entry through receivables, payments as well as invoices stay inside of the open transaction table and will stay there indefinitely until we make an action called paid transaction removal. The reason why accounts receivable and accounts payable do not follow the same process in terms of data flow from open to history is because in accounts receivable, the statement printing prints only data from the open transaction table and not history. Now, that's not something that we would normally find in a book, but the reasoning or the rationale as to why receivables doesn't follow payables is for that reason, so that we can print out statements. But when we are considering our month-end procedures within the Great Plains system, one of the routines that we have for accounts receivable is doing a paid transaction removal. And what this does is that it moves paid open invoices into history. This is our only ability to being able to move things to history so that we keep the open transaction table cleaned up. Now, one of the things about the data flow moving to history, more often than not across many parts of the system, is the ability to be able to move transactions from history into open. And we know that we can do that with the accounts payable system. Inside of accounts receivable, once they've arrived in history, there is nothing left that we can do about trying to get an open invoice back into the open transaction table. The only thing that we can do is remove those records and start over again by re-entering. So there are some differences in terms of data flow. Let's talk about general ledger as an example. When we're considering general ledger transactions, most of you who are working with general ledger see the screen on a daily basis. We know that when we're entering a transaction, it goes into batch. And when we go into batch, we're going into the work tables. But here's somewhat of an unknown kind of thing, is that all the transactions that we enter in to general ledger and are posted are going into the open transaction table. There is a column, if I can find this real quick, and I may not be able to, but there is a column in here that allows us to display where this transaction lies. And let me see if this might be the one here. Yes, right here. So it's document status. So here in General Ledger, if many of you are using SmartList, saying that these transactions are in work. And we go down the list and open, and eventually open transactions move to history. So the only time during the data flow within General Ledger is that transactions move from open to history is that when we perform a year-end closing inside of General Ledger. When we perform a year-end closing inside of General Ledger, transactions are moved, the journal entries that have come from all locations, payables, receivables, payroll, inventory, sales order processing, purchase order processing, direct entries inside of General Ledger are stored and posted in the open transaction table. But when we close a particular year, all of those entries are moved to history. That is part of the data flow process within the General Ledger system. So again, it's important when you begin to report data or look for data is to understand where it is, where transactions lie in their life cycle. And without understanding the life cycle and data flow becomes difficult in order to determine what type of inquiry and what type of reporting that you're going to conduct in order to find that. Let's take another example for you folks that are using payroll. I'm going to go back to SmartList here, and we'll look at payroll, and we'll look at payroll transactions versus historical transactions. Now, the only difference here in terms of transactional data movement within payroll versus accounts payable or accounts receivable, payroll transactions are understood as unposted transactions. These are transactions that are in batch and have not been processed. Whereas if I look at historical, I am actually looking at transactions that have been posted and represent checks in the system. So payroll transactions are represented here. These are processed or posted transactions that remain as part of the check and are shown in the historical tables. So when we begin to look at the payroll processing, is that we have work. We really don't have anything open per se, but once we post the checks in the system, they move from work to history. We do have the ability of voiding payroll checks in the system, but once we void a payroll check in the system, the check does not, or the entries that created the check, that would be the timesheet entries or possibly the vacation time that was recorded, does not come back into work ready for you to process again. What happens is that the system will just simply post them into the historical tables, and that's where they lie. If we void a check, the entries are marked as void. The check that is voided still remains inside of the payable system but under history, but nothing is impacted as far as the work tables or unposted data. So there's contrast and comparisons among modules in terms of how data flows. One of the other questions that come up during the question of trying to understand data flow is the relationships among modules. Now, one of the things that I've always advised people on is that when it comes to trying to void entries from one module to another, is that my mantra that I always say is go back to the point of origin. Now, what that really implies is you may be looking at the journal entry that was created by the accounts payable check. But you're not necessarily going to go to general ledger to void the journal entry that would ultimately void the check. You're not going to go into the bank reconciliation module and find the check and void it. What you're going to do is you're going to go back to the point of origination, and that would mean going back to accounts payable to void the check. By voiding the check at the historical level ensures you of creating a journal entry down at general ledger that reverses the credit to cash and the debit to accounts payable. It also reverses that transaction inside of the bank reconciliation module. So there is that kind of connection that exists among modules, but understanding the data flow and how general ledger was impacted by a certain transaction that was created in another module is particularly important in terms of how you go about managing that information or changing that information at a later time. Okay? All right. One of the things that I had mentioned a little earlier, that for those of you who are very interested in using other tools in terms of understanding the tables that are inside of Great Plains and where can I find them if I'm using a tool that directly accesses the data tables within Great Plains, and that is this, is that we have and all of you have this ability to being able to do this, short of maybe security that has been applied at your location, is to being able to look up the data dictionary and to look at how tables are stored and the table names and where you might be able to find them. So please make note of this, is that you're going to find this under the Microsoft Dynamics Tools, Resource Descriptions, and then Tables. Once you get in here, you're going to click the ellipse button, and then what you're also going to look for here is you're going to look for the module that you're focusing your attention or your search on. So let's just take purchasing as an example, and I am next going to change the view to grouping technical names. So what you're looking at is every table has a display name, and it also has a physical name as well. Now the physical name is what we were looking at a little earlier out here as we're looking at the data directly through Management Studio. And every table has a number in it and a name that's attached. So as I organize these, what I'm looking for is data that is similar in terms of nature, and if I'm going to go down here a little bit further, I'm going to run into what's called the payables historical logical files. And this is something that's going to get me a little closer to understanding where I need to look to find historical. There's the apply to information, so that would be the check history. The pay transaction file would indicate these are where I find the checks and the invoices that have been moved to history. That's what's storing that data. Go down here a little bit further. There are the reprint journals, the setup logical. There's the transaction logical. These are the unposted records in the system. And go down here, and here's the master records. So there's the PM Master 200. PM 00200. This is where all the vendors are stored. But just as importantly, by looking at this resource dictionary, if you're a SmartList user, this also is a nice resource to have to understanding where you might be able to find the data belonging to a certain view in order to find, so that you may find it much quicker and understand how data is stored. So if I drill down on this, I'm going to find all of the field names that belong to that particular table. It tells me here is the English name, here's the actual physical name that's stored, here is the type of data that's stored in the field and its position. So I realize this may seem a little esoteric, but it is something that, particularly for those of you who are doing inquiries and doing reporting and also trying to understand data flows in the system, is to become acquainted with this resource dictionary and occasionally come in here and look at it and use it so that it will help you find what you're looking for. I have a few minutes remaining, and I know I went through many things very rapidly. One of the things that I do want to do is I want to show you this particular URL, and I think it's very important that for you to have and for you to go back and use this as a review tool. And it will cover much of what I've spoken about today, but this will be a nice resource that you can have after our time together. But this was done by an individual who's a blogster and talks about data flow and table names. And much of what I've just talked to you about here is that this person also goes through and talks a little bit about how data flows are moving through the system, references to the SQL Management Studio that I was talking about a little bit earlier. There are the module names that was referring to, master record, work tables, temp tables, and a little deeper explanation as to each one of those tables and how they store data. And then down here it gets into data flow and talking about how data flows within each one of the modules. And even though that it may be a bit of a tough read, I think that if you spend just a little bit of time with it, some of this detail that is covered here in this blog will certainly help you in maybe gaining a deeper and better understanding of how data is flowing through the system. So it's a very nice blog that this person has put together. Now, one of the other things that many of you may not be aware of is that, particularly if we're looking at the payable system, the general ledger system, and the accounts receivable system, is that through security and through some options that we can set up, we may not need to commit a transaction to a batch first, thereby putting it into work and then later doing a batch posting. We do have the ability to post directly from this screen. So in other words, as we're posting or actually putting in records in one by one, hitting entering, posting, and entering, posting, they're going into temporary tables until we close the screen, and then posting is finally completed and transactions are moved from temporary directly into the open transaction table. So there are some contrasts to what I was explaining a little bit earlier in terms of the data flow within the system. So I wanted to make sure I mentioned that to you, especially when we're talking about that particular module of which we do move transactions in and out of through our posting through cash receipts, our recording of receipt entries through sales order processing, our entries through payroll, our entries through accounts payable. That bank reconciliation module behaves a little bit differently from the norm of what we expect of moving from work to open to history. All right. Looks like we've reached time, and I hope that all of you found this time beneficial. And as I pointed out to you in the very beginning, this is an awful lot of information in a very short period of time. I want to thank you all for attending.